My name's Buzz Thompson. I'm a professor here at Stanford Law School, as well as in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And I've worked for like the last 45 years, primarily in the freshwater field. And I am just so happy with what is truly a splendid panel to talk about binational management of shared natural resources. We're going to be focused, obviously, on the Canadian context, but this is an enormously important topic around the world. So the most recent study that I've seen on this says that there are 310 international river basins around the world. There is some debate over whether it's 310 or 247, but however one counts international river basins, virtually everyone agrees it's almost half of the land surface of the planet Earth, if you exclude Antarctica. And it generates about 60% of the water that we utilize. So again, international river basins, transnational water resources are incredibly important. Now, for me, I come and work primarily in the American Southwest. So when I think about international treaties, I think, for example, about the treaty between us and Mexico over the Rio Grande and the Columbia River, which was negotiated and agreed to in 1944. It's a treaty that basically divides up the consumptive use of a river. And so in the Southwest, what we're constantly arguing about is who gets to use how much water out of a particular river. In the Columbia Basin, and again, the panel is going to do a much more detailed overview of this than I will. The issue is not as much about who gets to use how much consumptively, but it's instead who effectively controls the flow of the river and how can we manage the flow of the river to produce hydroelectric power and also to avoid catastrophic downriver floods. In the year that the Colorado River Treaty was negotiated, 1944, the United States and Canada began negotiations over the Columbia River Treaty. It sort of proceeded along relatively slowly until 1948, which was the year of the Vanport flood, which was a massive flood that caused excessive damage all the way from Trail, British Columbia, all the way down to Astoria, Oregon. And that led everyone to realize that controlling the waters of the Columbia River through some type of a transnational treaty was incredibly important. It still took a while. It wasn't until 1961 that the two countries finally agreed to the Columbia River Treaty, which in that year was signed by President Eisenhower and Prime Minister Diefenbaker. Again, the Columbia River Treaty, very different than the Colorado River Treaty. It's really about hydroelectric power and flood control, with Canada agreeing to store water, which can then help in producing hydropower and also can help in reducing those downstream flood risks, in return for which Canada has received a series of payments for the flood control advantages, as well as a share of the downstream hydroelectric generation. The treaty never expires, but either country can basically void most of the provisions with 10 years' notice. More importantly, as of last year, the major flood control operations technically ended under the treaty, which led the two governments to start about 10 years ago looking at amending the treaty. And in fact, we actually had a workshop here at Stanford like about 15 years ago looking at what you would do as part of a renewal of the treaty. And the issues ranged from The United States saying Canada's getting too much money. Canada is saying, no, we're not getting enough money. And concerns over what are the implications for Native American nations and for the ecology, for the environment. So all of those issues were part of the mix of thinking about how to renegotiate the treaty. And the Biden and Trudeau administrations actually reached a revision in principle earlier this year, which, as I understand, and again, I think there will be more discussion on this, but as I understand it, the flood benefits to the United States were reduced, but the payments to Canada were increased. There was more opportunity for import and export of hydroelectric energy into Canada, and the tribes and the environmentalists were still upset that the treaty didn't do enough to protect the environment and the fish species of importance, in particular to the Native American and First Canadian nations. And then along came our current administration, which announced in March that everything was on hold because if Canada became a 51st state, we could just negotiate with ourselves. And so at the moment, that's where we stand, with the Canadians suggesting maybe we don't need a treaty at all. We actually are, when you stop to think about it, upstream. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. And the panel is, each of them are going to spend about 10 minutes in an initial introduction to their topic. Then we'll have a moderated discussion. And then we will open it all to you, and we'll make sure that all of you have time to ask your particular questions. As I said, this is an all-star panel. And we're going to start.
Sorry, I got stuck over there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's funny. You're trying to find that right moment.
I'm just trying to find it, and I couldn't find it.
Yeah,
So,
you got,
my apologies.
Stuck downstream without a panel. Anyway, so we, again, have an absolutely first-rate, all-star panel to discuss the various topics that I've raised at this particular point. So we will start with Richard Paisley. Richard Paisley's expertise is in transnational water management, an honorary research association with the University of British Columbia's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. He is, I'm pleased to know, a lawyer, but also somebody who is able to think about both law and science at the same time. And he is the director of the Global Transboundary International Water Governance Initiative, and has had about 3 decades of work in this particular area. So with that, Richard.
Well, thank you. Should we clap yet?
No, it's
feel
good.
like we should clap. Thank you.
We will make sure that we clap before every speaker as well as after.
Okay. No, I'm going to go back now. Okay, as always, I like to start with a disclaimer. What I tell you is going to be my personal opinion about everything. It doesn't reflect anything of my past, present, or future employers, the United Nations Department of Political and Peacekeeping Affairs, the Global Environment Facility of the World Bank, or the British Columbia government, or the federal government, or anybody else that I might have been associated either nefariously or otherwise over the last few years. I guess what I'd like to do is, reflecting off what I've heard earlier today, the questions, particularly from the students, which I found very compelling, I'm reminded of a very famous quote by Martin Luther King Jr. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I'd like that to be the theme of what I tell you, because it's easy to do gloom and doom, and I can do it with the best of them, but I think it's important that we keep that idea that even though the arc of the moral universe is long, it does bend towards justice. And I'm going to talk about the past and the present and the future in the Columbia. So international water law. Well, Dr. Thompson did a very good job of summarizing. There are over 300, how you count them, international water courses or international rivers in the world. And half the world's population and half the world is covered by them. So you'd think with that many, there must be a wealth of history and all kinds of possibilities for governance and good governance and cooperation. And if you thought that, you would be sort of wrong. It's not entirely gloom and doom, but there hasn't been the sort of focus and intensity of trying to do good governance of international waters that many of us in the business for all these years would like to think there should have been or could have been. The Columbia, historically, has been a notable outlier to that. The Columbia River, as was described, the fourth largest river in North America, interestingly flows from Canada, parts of it at least, into the United States, back into Canada, and back into the United States again. So this adds a whole new level of complication and political intrigue and hydrological intrigue as well to how it's governed. The other interesting thought about Canada-US in a broader context is because Canada sort of sits above the US in most map projections, including the one we saw earlier, people, including me, assumed that all water in Canada, such as it was that crossed the border, flowed into the United States. And that's not true. It turns out that 60% of those transboundary waters that cross the border go from Canada into the United States, but 40% go the other way. So when we talk about transboundary cooperation on water and and related issues such as energy and fish and that kind of thing, it's a two-way street, and we have to be very cognizant of that in my submission. The Columbia River Treaty was very well described. In summary, it's a complex document. It took 40 years to negotiate. Earlier, Governor Inslee said that persistence was important. The fact that it took 40 years to negotiate says a lot about water treaties generally, and even though Canada and the US historically have had the largest undefended border in the planet, it took them 40 years to reach an agreement. But I guess what I'd like to do is distinguish between what I call the Columbia River Treaty, which is the renegotiations of which are ongoing, as you heard, and Columbia River governance writ large, okay? So in my respectful submission, regardless of what happens with the Columbia River Treaty, it's going to be a rocky road, and always has been a rocky road. I mentioned the 40 years, but also the treaty only covers certain things. It's basically a flood control treaty and a power production treaty. So all the other things that have become more important and manifest in people's minds, that First Nations rights, Indigenous rights on both sides of the border, ecological factors, salmon, all these other things, can they be slammed into a Columbia River Treaty without major revisions? Would a major revision require Senate approval in the United States? Last time I looked, that would be an interesting situation. Or would it require parliamentary approval in Canada? Last time I looked, Canada is now in a minority government situation. So yes, we should focus on the Columbia River Treaty, but the bigger picture, the one that I exhort everyone to take a look at, is sort of Columbia River governance and all the things that entails. And I'll close talking about that arc of the moral universe bending towards justice on some specific ideas for things that give me personal hope for seeing that Columbia River governance is going to be where the action moves, regardless of what happens with the treaty or doesn't happen with the treaty. And as part of that, my colleague John O'Riordan is going to do an infomercial for a film he made, a very good film he made called Changing Course. And I exhort all of you to take, on your desk you'll see some materials about that. Okay, so the treaty renegotiation. As was mentioned, the treaty has been under renegotiation for some time. They came up with an agreement in principle. They certainly did, but the first thing I remember learning in contracts law when I went to law school a long time ago in California was that an agreement to agree means nothing, basically. And I don't think that has changed too much. The other thing that's interesting about the agreement in principle, although it's been held out by the negotiators as quite a remarkable event, is that it's not been released. We only have little snatches, little infomercials about what is in it. So no one, the public, for example, has not seen what this agreement in principle actually says in detail. So that's an interesting situation. And that, I think, in my respectful submission, is going to come back to bite people, because whenever I watched this happen with the Nile Treaty. In their zeal to do it in secrecy and their zeal to accomplish it, they were very, very careful to not release anything to anybody. And that was the death of the Nile Treaty that never came into fruition, complete fruition. The other thought I would have is the multi-term interim agreement. So the multi-term interim agreement, multi-year interim agreement, is another document which, in the analysis of most people who've taken an independent look at it, massively favors the United States. The United States essentially got everything it wanted in terms of lesser Canadian entitlement, money being come across the border, and it got less, better deal with flood control and so on and so forth. But Canada never did get to the things that were important to them: the fisheries, the First Nations, the public participation in the process, and so on and so forth. Okay, so cooperation. Cooperation, I think, has always been the key. And one of the reasons I've had the privilege of going around the world talking about the Columbia River Treaty is there was unprecedented cooperation between Canada and the United States in order to negotiate it and in order to implement it. But that cooperation has now been severely eroded and is eroding even more through a number of factors. One is the generation of people that worked for the Bonneville Power Administration and the Corps of Engineers and BC Hydro are retiring. And those agencies in the United States are being decimated. And that's happening, similar thing is happening in Canada. So, and then there's the whole thing that was alluded to by Dr. Thompson with the 51st state rhetoric going back and forth across the border. But I guess my hopes for the future include that long legacy of cooperation that existed for so many years, and that gave me the ability to go to the Nile and the Mekong and Central Asia and Afghanistan, where I'm very active now, and tell them that cooperation is better than confrontation. That when people cooperate, they can get more benefits. There's a mutual gains way of looking at these things. The second thing that gives me hope is what I hope will be a nascent movement towards, thank you, International River Basin Organization. And that's back to my previous point. Whatever happens with the Columbia River Treaty, it's not even looking at an International River Basin Organization. Much of the world where there's been successful governance or more successful governance of international river basins on a wide scale has been because they've developed and implemented and fed and watered an International River Basin Organization. And finally, I'd make the pitch for third-party mediation. Again, I'm hopelessly biased. I work with the United Nations Mediation Support Unit, but we've had tremendous success in places you'd never expect to have it because we've had third-party mediators and technical experts. Yes, Canada and the US have a lot of expertise, but having that third party there, able to hear both sides and come up with constructive ideas, in my respectful opinion, makes all the difference in the world. So that's enough for now. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
So thank you very much, Richard. So now we're going to actually move over to hydropower.
Yep.
And our next speaker, again, somebody with just decades of experience in this particular field, is Kurt Miller, who's been involved in the hydroelectric area for over 30 years. He is currently the CEO and executive director of the Northwest Public Power Association, and previously he was executive director of the Northwest River Partners. So, Kurt.
Come on, we clap for him.
Yeah.
I try to do these things with a sense of humor. I laugh at my own jokes, so you don't have to laugh at them for me. I will say, the one thing I did want to say is, finally I got into Stanford. It was like almost 40 years later than I had anticipated, but like former Governor Inslee, I feel tremendous vindication for now having been invited to come and speak here. So it's a great honor to get to come and talk to you. I live in Vancouver, Washington, so the Little Vancouver, which is just across the river, the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. All things Columbia River are very important to me. I grew up in Troutdale, Oregon, and I went to Columbia High School, which was named after the river. And then I went to Willamette University because I couldn't get into Stanford. But Willamette is a tributary of the Columbia. And so all these things in the region, they all have tremendous meaning to me, and it is really neat to get to be here with this esteemed panel and with a very esteemed audience as well. I represent the Northwest Public Power Association, and we essentially are a trade association that provides education and training, advocacy and information to 155 not-for-profit utilities across the western United States. We've been doing that, fulfilling that mission for those entities since 1940. So the importance of hydropower. I've spent the last basically 6 years of my career somewhat as a hydropower advocate for community-owned electric utilities. And I'm here today to kind of set the context of why hydropower is so important to British Columbia, to the Pacific Northwest, but also to the greater Western grid. So this chart here shows the amount of hydroelectricity that is produced in the greater Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and western Montana. That's on the left chart, the blue slice of the pie. So it's almost 50% of the entire region's generation comes from hydroelectricity. In British Columbia, it's way higher. They are at basically around 87 to 89%, depending on the year you look at. So hydropower has a very outsized role in generation for the greater Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, and it's very, very important to both regions. Not only that, though, but you may not know this, but hydropower from the Northwest and Canada, California has its own hydropower as well, but Northwest and Canadian hydropower is a big part of what allows the grid to operate in California. Californians, I'm going to say you all, I don't know where you're from, but I'm going to pretend like you're all from California. You all essentially use the hydropower system as a giant battery. And so in the daylight hours, when it's not as hot out, but you still have a lot of sunshine here, you will send hydropower up to the Pacific Northwest. The dams will actually, then the hydroelectric dams will hold back on generation. They'll hold that water behind the dam to a certain extent. And then in the evening, when the sun starts to set here, solar panels stop producing energy, the hydropower system will send that energy back. So this is just from January of this year, and you could see the diurnal shape, just every day, an exchange of energy between the renewable energy in California and the renewable energy in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. And that's a new pattern, actually. If you'd looked about 10 years ago, it would have been largely all exports into California. But now, with all the solar power that's been built, you have this daily exchange of energy. I am going to, and I don't think he's in the room, so it's even safer for me to do this now. I'm going to slightly disagree with Governor Inslee on some of the things. First of all, I do accept climate science, so I'm not coming at it from that perspective at all. But the picture of the electric grid in North America is much less rosy than what Governor Inslee had indicated. We are seeing reports from national reliability organizations and grid watchdog groups and regional groups as well that basically are saying the entire United States electric grid is at unusually high risk of blackouts. This quote, and I'll share a few with you. I won't read. I know you're all excellent readers because you got into Stanford, so I'll let you do your own reading. But we basically have different organizations all saying the same thing, which is that the grid is in a really precarious position, that our ability to actually meet our decarbonization goals is diminished, and that because of greater demand on the grid and the combination of other things, that we all risk facing high level of blackouts. So what are the things that are what are the things that are causing that? One of the things is that we are retiring fossil fuels. Now, from a climate perspective, that is a good thing, right? I don't think anyone would deny that, but fossil fuels act as on-demand generation. You can turn them on and off when you need them, and they can operate on a 24/7 basis. We're trying to actually replace those then with different kinds of generation, intermittent generation, wind resources, solar power, even with batteries. they are not always available, and especially because batteries typically have about a duration of release of around 4 hours. So you have this intermittency problem where you're essentially trying to take renewable generation like wind and solar power and kind of fit a square peg into a round hole. And it doesn't fill the gap that's left by the fossil fuels retiring, and that's a challenge. Also, permitting is incredibly difficult. The land use associated with, and the Nature Conservancy did a great study on this, but the land use associated with building wind and solar power takes up so much land. And the more that we try to build, the harder that communities seem to be pushing back against some of those things. And then lastly, a huge increase compared to the last 20 years in terms of demand. A lot of that is AI-driven data center demand, but also a shift to electric vehicles and electrification of homes. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing. So in that context, hydropower really is more important now than possibly it has been in the history of its life in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. Those resources are carbon-free, and they're really needed to make ends meet to make the grid reliable. So you can't really talk about hydropower without talking about salmon. And I know that we have First Nations and Indigenous tribal session later today, and I'm very interested to hear about that. I will just say here that I think that in some cases, hydropower gets blamed for more harm to salmon than might be reasonable. And why I say that is, first of all, we invest a tremendous amount. The Bonneville Power Administration, which markets the generation from the federal hydropower system, it spends about $500 million a year, $500 million a year on fish and wildlife programs. And so it's about 25% of their entire power supply budget goes to that. If you look since the first federal dam was built on the Columbia River, that was Bonneville Dam in 1938, you could see that throughout time, and then when the first Lower Snake River Dam was built, and then the last Lower Snake River Dam was built, we are seeing much larger returns than were experienced in the early years or even shortly before those dams were built. There used to be way more salmon in the river, but Europeans and their descendants basically overfished the river and really caused tremendous damage. So I think the bigger debate really is whether dams are hurting the recovery, but the dams are not the entities or that actually ended up causing that huge decline in salmon. I will say that there is a separate issue for Grand Coulee Dam, which was built without any fish passage. And so native tribes who were upstream of Grand Coulee Dam immediately lost all access to salmon. And I think that's something that the whole region wants to work on. And D.R. Michel is here today, and he's going to talk about their efforts to reintroduce salmon above Grand Coulee Dam. And this is a similar chart that I'm sharing for the Lower Snake River dams in terms of how salmon returns have been since those times. So that doesn't mean that the salmon picture is rosy or where we want it to be. There are many species that are still endangered, but I just want to say that it's not a direct cause and effect in many cases of dams being built and salmon populations not doing well. So with that, I look forward to the rest of the panel and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we had an initial presentation on governance of transnational waterways, and then we have now been talking about hydropower. Now what we're going to do is to begin looking at the economics of this system. And for that, we have Jonathan Yoder. And Jonathan actually was here for the workshop that we did 15 years ago on the Columbia River, and so it's great to have him back. Economist who's worked for over 20 years in the water field. He's the director of the state of Washington's Water Research Center. He's also a distinguished professor for sustainable development at Washington State University's School of Economic Sciences. And so with that, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Thompson. It's good to see you after so many years again. So I'm an economist. We've heard a lot of really interesting details about the Columbia River Treaty and things related to it. I'm going to strip away all of that interesting stuff and talk about some kind of economic fundamentals with respect to the original Columbia River Treaty and some of the changes, the proposed changes that have been announced, at least partly, in the what's called the Agreement in Principle, the AIP. This is public released information. It's tentative, but interesting and informative. So I'm going to start with some fundamentals about the basin heading into the 1960s. In a typical year, about 25% of the water that flows down the Columbia through Washington State and out into the Pacific comes from British Columbia. In high water years, 40% or more of that flow comes from British Columbia. So a lot of water comes out of Canada through the U.S. By 1960, there were 8 major U.S. hydroelectric dams in operation on the Columbia River main stem, with more in tributaries and more still under construction. It was apparent then that additional upstream storage could be used to retime flows through the U.S. system of dams and boost their hydroelectric generation capacity. It had also helped reduce flooding along the Columbia River. Devastating floods near Portland, Oregon in 1948 highlighted the value of additional potential flood control capacity. As geography would have it, British Columbia had some of the best remaining reservoir sites in the Columbia River Basin. But crucially, the dams that would create those reservoirs had not yet been built. If those dam sites were developed, the U.S. could become a main beneficiary of the storage that they would create if they were managed to provide flood control and hydropower benefits. This sounds like a situation where a deal could be struck, and the Columbia River Treaty was that deal. But why was the treaty designed the way it was? We'll use a little bit of economics intuition to think about the structure of that original Columbia River Treaty. So suppose Canada invested in building the dams on their own and then tried to sell flood control and hydropower services to the U.S. on an as-needed basis in a spot market. Might seem reasonable. People interact on spot markets all the time. Except that for this to happen, there would be big upfront investments that were needed to provide those services. And there is only one possible customer for them, the U.S., right? These dams would be what economists call relationship-specific assets. So imagine this. Canada builds and pays for the infrastructure, and then when it's time to sell the services from those dams and reservoirs, the U.S. lowballs their payment offer. They offer just enough to cover Canada's operating costs, but not enough for them to recoup construction costs over time. With no other potential buyer, it would be in Canada's interest to accept that lowball offer in order to cover at least a fraction of their investment costs. This is what economists call a hold-up problem. Without a credible long-term agreement that assured Canada of sufficient remuneration to cover their capital investment costs, Canada would have little incentive to build the dams in the first place. And so the original treaty, the original Columbia River Treaty, solved this hold-up problem. It was a textbook case of using a long-term contract to overcome this type of investment risk. So here's what the 1961 Columbia River Treaty stipulated, stylistically and in really general terms. Canada would build 3 dams, providing 15.5 million acre-feet of storage, and the U.S. would build Libby Dam in Montana with its reservoir extending into Canada. This was part of that little dip in the Columbia River where water comes out of Canada into the U.S. and then back up into Canada. In return, the U.S. would pay $64 million upfront to guarantee 9 million acre-feet of flood control storage annually for 60 years. In exchange for help optimizing U.S. hydropower production, Canada would receive half of the potential hydropower benefits generated by Canada's coordinated releases. This payment is known as the Canadian entitlement. British Columbia then pre-sold the first 30 years of that entitlement to U.S. utilities for $254 million and used it to finance the dams. This sale revenue reduced Canada's investment risk even further. Okay, so it was a way of reducing that holdup risk that they faced in the original Columbia River Treaty. So the original treaty was really narrow in scope. It's been part of what it's been criticized for 60 years now, or more actually. It focused nearly entirely on flood control and hydropower. It was also relatively rigid and inflexible, but that rigidity provided contractual clarity and predictability for both Canada and the US to overcome this holdup problem. That was back in 1961, 1964. So fast forward to today now, okay? At least 3 important things have changed. First, the dams are built and paid for. Okay? Canada no longer faces this original holdup risk, but the services they can provide are still relationship specific. And now it's the US that faces a different kind of holdup problem. If the US has to negotiate emergency flood storage in real time under duress, they would be at a disadvantage. It also takes some foresight to manage reservoirs for effective flood control, so long-term agreements are still valuable from the US perspective. Secondly, management interests are more complex than were recognized by the original treaty. Today, we're not just talking about flood control and power, we're talking about reintroduction of viable salmon populations, tribal cultural values, irrigation, recreation, and the general ecological health of the Columbia River Basin system, among other interests. All of these are explicitly part of the current dialogue over the next round of treaty negotiations. This negotiation space is much broader and reflects more complexity and more uncertainty under current conditions. Third, technology, management technology has advanced. Hydrologic modeling, forecasting, and communications tools are far more sophisticated. This means that we can manage water systems more dynamically, closer to real time, with less risk than was possible in the 1960s. Together, these changes create a premium on flexibility and adaptation and reduce the riskiness of a more dynamic management approach. So what might a modernized Columbia River Treaty look like? The AIP and public stance statements from the negotiation teams give us some idea. Canada wants more flexibility to manage its reservoirs for a wider range of domestic interests. And with the dams already built, it doesn't need that same degree of pre-commitment from the US to recoup its investments. The US still benefits from having predictable access to Canadian storage, especially for managing flood risk. A long-term agreement's still valuable, but with technology advances, it can better manage the risks associated with its reliance upon on-demand services. So here are some specific changes. Here are some specific changes that are identified in what we know about the AIP. Canada will provide less fixed flood control storage and more reliance on on-demand services. But some form of long-term pricing agreement to alleviate the new holdup problem that the U.S. faces is likely. There aren't many details about this, but I envision something like an options contract that provides some surety up front and an opportunity for the U.S. to call on power when it needs it. Because there will be less pre-specified storage, the AIP specifies a smaller Canadian entitlement. That said, it appears that Canada will be receiving an additional payment annually of $16.5 million or so that monetizes the benefits that the U.S. receive in terms of irrigation, recreation, navigation, and fisheries, that these benefits were not recognized in the original treaty. Salmon recovery and climate change add significant uncertainty about future operations, but more flexibility in a new Columbia River Treaty would allow Canada, and for that matter the US, more flexibility to adjust as managers learn what works and what doesn't for meeting Canadian objectives. So the original treaty was a workable solution, not without controversy, but a workable solution for its time, and is often hailed as a highly successful cross-boundary water management agreement. It was narrow, it was rigid, and it only addressed a couple of specific management problems, along with that economic holdup problem. But the fundamental economics still support a long-term treaty. The Canadian reservoirs are still a big portion of storage capacity in the basin, and there hasn't been much change in U.S. storage capacity since then. So the services that Canada can provide are still valuable to the U.S. But the management problem is recognized to be broader in scope and more complex than was reflected in the original treaty, and the tools for more efficient management have improved to help to meet those challenges. A new, more flexible, dynamic and inclusive Columbia River Treaty seems to be a reasonable direction for joint management of the river basin. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much, Jonathan. And so from that, Jonathan, we're going to turn to another Jonathan, this one with tremendous governmental experience. So John O'Riordan was the former Deputy Minister of Sustainable Resource Management for the British Columbia government. He has spent over 35 years in public service, and he is currently an associate with the Polis Project for ecological governance at the University of Victoria. So, John.
Thank you very much, Buzz. One of the disadvantages of coming last is people have said everything you want to say in the first three presentations, but I'm going to break a little bit of new ground. I do want to unashamedly promote the documentary film that I did with the Creatively United for the Planet Society in Victoria with some financial support from the BC. This is a film that preceded the AIP, but is a set of stories told by about 20 leading community activists, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, about what Canada is looking for in a renewed treaty. I was very lucky to get an outstanding young videographer to be the person who created the film, and I do encourage you to see it. It's an hours-long film. You've got the QR code, so you can just flick it on. But it is beautifully filmed, and I think the stories are heartfelt and told by a whole range of groups. But the word changing course is not just a play on words, it's real, because from the Canadian perspective, there's an imbalance in the original treaty between the commercial side of the treaty and the environmental side of the treaty. So the whole idea of this film was to encourage a change in the course of the treaty to rebalance environmental values with economic values. And the principal ones have been outlined by Jonathan, but I'll briefly cover them. Flood control was the trigger for the renovation of the Columbia Treaty. So the Canadian negotiators back in 1964 had a full stop on flood control from Canada's reservoirs in 2024. So there was no choice, but the Americans had to renegotiate because they're extremely vulnerable to flood risk in the States. You've completely developed your floodplains, and there's no way that you could protect against a flood, especially in a changing climate, without storage control from Canada. So an interim agreement has been applied for 3 years, 2024 to 2027, to give some flood relief to the US at the price of about $36 million a year. So this is the first tranche of payments in and above for the treaty for direct flood control. But the point is that interim agreement expires in 2027. So the same issue will crop up in 2027. So there will have to be a rebalancing of the treaty after 2027. It's not going away. But on the other side of the coin, the Canadians were looking for flexibility to manage the reservoirs levels much more in nature's keeping. So we negotiated a 5 million acre foot, so roughly a third of all the storage in Canada can now be reprogrammed to protect environmental values in and around the reservoirs and for fish in the Canadian Columbia. This is very important because at this point in time, the drawdowns are massive, 40 or 50 meters. So you have large areas that are open desert, very non-productive environmentally, loss of fish values. And in fact, you get dust storms and lots of massive problems of access to the reservoirs. But with the agreement in principle, that will significantly change. So 5 million acre feet can be repurposed to vegetate the riparian zones and bring the life back to these reservoirs, which will be essential. And the other thing is that the Canadian required that the Columbia Salmon Reintroduction Program, which was initiated by the Indigenous tribes on both sides of the border, became part of the new treaty. So there was a common purpose from both sides to commit to reintroducing salmon into the Upper Columbia. It's important to know that the treaty did not cut the salmon off. It was the Grand Coulee Dam was built 10 years before the treaty, or 20 years before the treaty. But I do want to talk about one thing that's not been mentioned, and that's climate change. There is an existential threat to the Columbia because of a changing climate. And in the States, you'll be faced with significantly changed temperatures, dry conditions, and more importantly, rain rather than snow in the watersheds. So the hydropower profile in the US portion of the Columbia will change dramatically. In Canada, we will continue to have snow for a while, but our glaciers are melting. And by the end of the century, we'll have no glaciers in the Columbia and a much smaller snowpack available. So that will dramatically change the balance of convenience between US and Canada. In the short run, Canada is going to have an advantage. On the long run, we both need to cooperate. There is no way that we can jointly meet the joint needs of power, flood control, and environmental resilience without collaboration and cooperation. It just simply won't happen. And climate change will be the forcing element. The final point I want to make is the role of First Nations in the Columbia negotiations and going forward, because the next panel will include that in detail. But most of you may or may not know, but in Canada, both the federal government and the provincial government have put into law the commitment to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So that's a big change in policy, because what it means is that First Nations don't only have to be consulted, they actually have to give informed consent to projects. And so in Canada, I'm not quite sure where we are in the States here, the Canadian First Nations have been equal partners in the negotiating table. So they're fully involved, their values have been expressed in the AIP, and they continue to be involved. So not only are they shaping the final treaty, but they're shaping two other things. One is revenue sharing. So the First Nations in Canada got a down payment of 15% of all revenues coming from the Columbia Treaty. That's a significant amount of money. That's about $50 million. But that's a down payment. It's not finished yet. The negotiations are ongoing. So to the extent that we have money from the Canadian Entitlement and Flood Control, some of that money is going to flow directly to First Nations for their own purposes. The second point of this is that there has to be informed consent. In other words, they want a role on governance of the final treaty. Right now, the governance is run by utilities because it's a commercial treaty. In the future, a balanced treaty between environmental interests, fisheries interests, and commercial interests will need a new governance model. And that governance model has to have a role for First Nations on both sides of the border to play a significant part. The First Nations have principles, they have powerful values, they have strong Indigenous commitments to the river. These voices have to be heard on a day-to-day basis on the management of the Columbia going forward. Otherwise, it will be a weaker treaty. I just want to say quite proudly that all of these values are portrayed in this film. And there's some wonderful footage of Indigenous ceremonies recognizing the value of salmon, not only just swimming up, but they are the nutrient source of the Columbia. So when you see it, the fish are picked up by the eagles. The nutrient then is spread around the forests and the trees and the soils. The Columbia would not be the system it is right now without fish and without a harmonious ecosystem. So the commitment to changing course so that we rebalance environmental, commercial, and social and spiritual values is critical to the long-term success of the Columbia. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chen. So now what we're going to do is spend about 15, 20 minutes on a moderated discussion. Then after that, as I said, we will open it for questions. So please be thinking about what questions you'd like to ask. I actually want to start this portion with two of the topics that John raised a moment ago. The first one is climate change. So we know around the world that water resources are going to be vastly changed. And we'll have to deal with a very, very different climate system. And so I'm just curious, right now, how well is climate change integrated into the planning for the Columbia River system? And is the Columbia River system, that's not just the treaty, but all of the various aspects, what will it need to do in order to adjust to climate change?
Yeah. Can I? Okay, go ahead, please.
I was going to say,
For all of these, people should just jump in.
I have nothing to lose. Not very well is the answer. And there's a particular disconnect across the border, right, between Canada and the United States on climate change. And it doesn't help that the cult that your first speaker, Jay Inslee, talked about is alive and well on both sides of the border. We were very lucky to have an election that elected someone as good as it did, but it was closer than people like to think. If a certain number of votes had changed a different way, we would have a climate change denier in power in Canada as well. On the numbers, something like, I think, was it that percentage of flow that comes out of Canada and the United States, I think it's 25% right now, average, is supposed to bump to at least 40. So that's a huge amount of water going down to the United States from Canada. So, yeah.
25%, it's 40%, and climate change projections bumped it up to 50 or more.
Okay, those numbers are controversial, but yes, it's going to be significantly higher. Let's leave it at that. So,
my take, and thank you, Richard. I have followed, some of the science on this. Obviously, I'm spending a decent amount. I started my career at the Bonneville Power Administration. I've followed hydropower ever since, and it's been a part of my role. The University of Washington Climate Impacts Group and other well-respected groups have essentially said it's very hard to predict the amount of precipitation going forward, but most models indicate that we'll have about the same amount of precipitation, at least in the Columbia River Basin. But the timing, I think Jonathan mentioned, it's going to fall much more as rain than it does as snow. We're going to lose a kind of a natural storage bank that we had for hydropower. So the shape of it could be, one thing we definitely think is there will be less summer flows available on a natural basis. That if you can't capture it with the dams, then if it just goes through the river, it's going to be gone, right? So I think that that's a big issue. So in terms of coordination, how are we thinking about that on the power supply system? I think we're trying to think about, okay, what resources, if we get, essentially it looks like we're going to get more generation in the winter from hydropower and less in the summer. So then you need, when you're thinking about, and your question about coordination is a little different than this, but I'm thinking of it from a utility perspective. We're trying to think about, okay, what resources then do we need to complement that change in shape of hydropower with?
So let me actually just follow up on the hydropower subject for a second. So we have a variety in California of multi-purpose reservoirs. And we know that one of the problems with climate change is going to be trying to manage those for both flood protection and hydropower at the same time. It's going to require better modeling than we have right now, better projections. Is that true also with hydropower in the Northwest?
I mean, I think one of the things that we could lose, but it looks like we're going to lose a little bit. When I say we, the United States parties in a renegotiated treaty, is that we're going to have to use Grand Coulee Dam now to keep more space in case floodwaters come early, right? And so that means less economic use for generation, right? We're going to have to push it through instead of save it for later in the summer, for instance, if that makes sense. So the way the dams work for flood control is you have to reserve space, right? And so now all of a sudden, if Grand Coulee Dam is pushed down to a lower operating range, then you have less water available for fish. Or looks like we have an assistant. We have less hydropower available for both fish and power generation in the summer. Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump?
I just wanted to make, in your introduction, Buzz, you said that the Columbia tree had no termination date. Climate has no termination date. We're running at a moving train. The climate is going to continue to change for centuries. And so there is no set time that you can manage for. The only option is adaptive management. You have to continue to adapt the way you manage fish, the way you manage riparian zones, the way you manage hydropower, the way you manage recreation. Have some measurable indicators that recognize some success, and that as the climate changes, you continuously adapt to that new reality. If we don't do that, we're in trouble.
And assuming that we ultimately do get a revised treaty, does that include more ability to adapt?
I think so, yeah. I think Jonathan mentioned the new models that are available now. There's a lot more technique. Artificial intelligence is going to play a big role in the way we manage that. So I think I have actually some faith that we can adapt. I have no faith that we can bring our carbon emissions down quickly enough.
Yeah.
I would argue, sorry if I may, I would just argue that the adaptive management has to be on the institutional level as well. My guess is whatever institutions we come up with, either within the treaty or outside of the treaty in terms of international governance, are going to be flawed or they're going to become aged out. So we need to have a mechanism, or we should have a mechanism, that looks at institutional adaptive management. And when I work on treaties throughout the world, that's what I try to, however I can, get that in there. I don't see that happening in the Columbia at this point in time, unfortunately. So.
And Richard, I'm sorry, Jonathan?
Yeah. So this is rare that it's taken me so long to jump in here, but this is a great panel. I guess the only, everything that comes to mind immediately has already been discussed, except for there is an issue with respect to agriculture that is pretty interesting and pretty difficult, and I'll use Washington State as an example, and that is in Washington State, the expectation is that growing seasons are going to move forward to be earlier in the spring, but water needs are also going to be changing in ways that are a little bit hard to predict. The state of Washington Department of Ecology is trying to figure out how they are going to adjust water rights in a way that is equitable and frankly functional, so that irrigation water rights can be modified in a systematic way so that they can be used earlier in the year to be functionally useful or optimized, if you will, for for agriculture. And those kind of on-the-ground complexities that relate to some of the things that Kurt was talking about, changes in the hydrologic cycle, changes of the timing, this tension, if you will, between flood storage and an interest in holding water in the reservoirs for the purpose of providing water for irrigation when summer flows are lower and warmer. That tension is going to be exacerbated.
That's a great point.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is great because all of this is fascinating in terms of the Columbia River, but all of these are issues that we face in many other areas of the United States and the world. And so you're beginning to, provide us with examples here that we can potentially utilize. So, John, another thing you talked about was basically using reservoirs for the fish. And that's also something that we've been talking about here in California, which is for years now we have seen reservoirs as the enemies of fish, but they're there. And we can begin to reoperate them to provide water at times when the fish need them. And so I'm curious about two things. The first is what the opportunities are in the Columbia River system for, as you point out, John, actually beginning to take that storage capacity and use it for the fish. Are we going to make enough of that available? And second of all, what else do we need to be doing in order to protect the fish to the degree we can?
Two critical factors for fish: flows and temperature. So we've talked about the possibility of getting more flows, and Kirk has indicated what some of the utilities are required to do under law. But the temperature of the Columbia River, particularly in the States, is going to go above lethal levels for fish in the next 10 or 15 years. And so it's going to be imperative that the reservoirs have some ability to get the deeper, cooler water across the spillway and into the river to try and moderate that temperature rise. And the other thing is going to have to be, there's going to have to be niche areas, and right, that's why I'm so encouraged about having riparian green up in Canada, so that we can use nature to cool the waters in the reservoirs through this greenery and transpiration to retain niche habitats for fish so that they can survive. Fish are very resilient. There's multiple genetic codes, and somehow or other they find a way of surviving through different, because there's 100 different fish. 90 of them may be lost because of climate change, but 10 of them survive. And these 10 then adapt to and create new fish or new conditions for fish to survive. So it's only though, if you have a resilient ecosystem that is based on nature, that we can survive the Columbia in the next 25, 30 years.
Okay. And Jonathan?
Yeah, so before I say what I'm going to say, I'll underscore the importance of habitat restoration and kind of natural systems. But a couple of things that are talked about and actually being invested in or proposed in Washington State include in fact, the only dams that I'm hearing about for Washington State are off-channel dams. Not dams that go across the main channel of a river, but off-channel dams that can then be used to provide water in the late summer, for example, in an attempt to help cool water for fisheries, and also aquifer storage, managed aquifer recharge, and then natural outflows from those managed aquifer recharge programs to help augment stream flow as a way of trying to help both with temperature and flow.
Yeah, I just like to pitch in just real quickly. I think that what we're hearing is, I agree with everything we're hearing. I think your initial question was really interesting, which is kind of dams have been perceived as the enemy of fish, but because we're losing that snowpack recharge system, that snowpack bank of water, now do we need to build more reservoirs to capture that so that fish have water available for them in the summer months. And I think that's something we have to look at, because the Columbia River system, still so much water escapes, without storage. We don't have the same amount of storage, especially in the United States, as they do in Canada. Canada can store a lot more. They can store multi-year, water. We don't really do that in the United States side. So I think that looking at other opportunities to create storage specifically for potentially fish releases could be important.
Yeah. In California here, it was probably about close to 10 years ago now, we passed a major bond measure, and a significant portion went towards the construction of new storage projects, but you could only get the state money for environmental aspects of that storage. For example, storing water specifically for the environment. It was poorly implemented, but I still like the concept behind it. So Richard, you've talked a lot about sort of governance structures. We've spent a lot of time talking specifically about the Columbia River Treaty. Is there a need for a broader Columbia River Basin organization? And if so, what would that look like?
Good question. Well, I've drank the Kool-Aid, so I totally believe in international river basin organizations. And I can point to, innumerable examples around the world where they've been highly successful. I don't see the Columbia River Treaty, however it's modified, getting to the level of cooperation and intensity and cross-border collaboration that a properly designed international river basin organization would get. I'm not completely naive. I see the political obstacles that are there, and I'm not totally convinced that it has to be an IRB. I mean, we was talking earlier, form needs to follow function. But the functions that are sort of conspicuous by their absence now, that you see in many international river basin organizations throughout the world, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, are robust public participation, a component, and you're on top of this one, where people are linking spirituality, indigeneity, and the rights of rivers. And I think that's a direction we need to move. One of the things that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle in the Columbia is the iconic value that salmon, well, the river has itself, but salmon have. It's above and beyond any imaginable economic value. But I think we need mechanisms that are going to enshrine that and celebrate that. And I don't see that happening in any agreement in principle, however constituted on the Columbia River Treaty itself, right? I fear that we'll lose momentum after the treaty is whatever happens to it, right? And people will move on.
Yeah, and John.
Well, the current government is incredibly narrow. I mean, it's just 3 utilities. And so, but that's the nature of the 1964 agreement. But we've just outlined in the last half hour the massive changes in function on the Columbia, adaptive management, dealing with climate change, including the First Nations as leaders of the community and vocal proponents for their values. And real challenges on the economic and environmental front that no utility-based organization could do the job. It has to be a much broader-based governance model. And hopefully that will be negotiated over when the treaty is being finalized.
Great. So we have about 3 minutes left of this moderated discussion, and so I have to ask for each of your predictions as to what will happen now over the next 4 or 5 years. Will we have a new treaty, and what will that look like?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
Some years ago, when I was younger and foolisher than I am now, I worked on a major billion-dollar piece of litigation involving water and rivers and fisheries and everything. And one of the wise lawyers on the team, who later became a Supreme Court judge, said to me, he said, we're going to lose this case, but we will declare victory, and we'll give everybody on our side awards. And I said, you're kidding me. And he said, I just looked shell-shocked. I still have the award in my office that I've framed, a Deputy Minister's Special Commendation for Outstanding Service to the Public Service. And I'm an optimist. But I'm cautiously optimistic that with the kind of people I see out here, the students at Stanford University, if that's typical of what's out there in the world, there's some hope. But but don't wait for the government to do it for you.
So I was a special master for the U.S. Supreme Court in a case between Montana and Wyoming. And at the end of the case, both Montana and Wyoming declared that they had won.
Yeah.
And that was the press release that they each put out. So it's true everywhere.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks.
John.
Well, 5 years from now, Canada will still be a sovereign state. We're going to outlast the Trump administration. But don't underestimate this trigger of flood control. You're extremely vulnerable in the States on flood control. There's no way that you can't have some kind of long-term flood control agreement with Canada. It just won't work. That is a turnkey for a more imaginative, adaptive model of a new treaty that may be modified from the EIP, but it's along the lines of rebalancing environmental, social, and cultural values with the commercial values of the treaty. And it's only going to happen within 5 years.
So my take, I mentioned I live in Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver, Washington is essentially where Vanport, very close to where Vanport was, which resulted in deaths and in destruction of what at the time was Oregon's second largest city. So I'm very sensitive to the need for flood control. I think there's a need to get something done on the utility side, and I did look up the number before I came on the panel. The United States utilities have basically said that we're overpaying for the economic benefits of the hydropower shaping by about $300 million a year. So there's a huge financial incentive to do something different, and then there is also a huge incentive, as Jonathan mentioned, to make sure that poor Vancouverites like me are not submerged under the river. So I think that there is momentum on both sides to get something done. This current administration, it's not uncommon for one administration to kind of pause things before another, that the other administration was working on. The original Trump administration, the first Trump administration, was actually working on this as well. So it's like, I think something will get done.
But when?
Oh, that's fair. I do think within 5 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Me too.
Okay, sounds good. And this is perfect because we've just started to, count backwards here, which is our sign that we need to go to your questions. So, and I gather there will be a microphone that will be walked around, so maybe you start with Dr. Kennedy.
Kurt, I think I have two questions. I'm going to address them directly to you. A couple of things that haven't been mentioned or haven't been dwelt on adequately. Can you say something about the increasing demand for the hydro-generated power in the Northwest because of the proliferation of server farms and especially AI, number one. Number two, something that hasn't been mentioned, it's a little bit orthogonal to the discussion so far, but maybe you could educate this audience about the controversies around the 4 lower snake dams.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for this question. So the first is, as good as California has done in decarbonization, like Washington State has gotten like 2/3 of its electricity from hydroelectricity, forever. And the Northwest overall is already at 50% just on hydropower. We've got like another 10% on wind and then a little bit less on solar. But I represent members in rural communities who are seeing gigawatts worth of new demand wanting to be served. And so the Mid-Columbia utilities, which they built their own dams on the central, kind of the curve out of the Columbia River below Grand Coulee Dam, there's a huge line at their doors trying to get, because they want affordable, reliable, and carbon-free, right? Because they have all the AI data, all the data centers, they have their own renewable energy targets and decarbonization targets. So that was a match made in heaven, but now there's no more. Like we are out. There is no more additional hydropower, right? Yeah. And so I think that's a challenge. And so now it really is looking like now, is Washington and Oregon, are they, where we were so well situated to maybe achieve some of these completely, 100% renewable, or close to 100% renewable clean energy targets, that's becoming really in question right now. So I think that's our advantage is no longer, we just don't have surpluses. The second question about the lower Snake River dams, there's tremendous controversy about those dams. They were built in the 60s and 70s, and they were controversial before they were built, and there's not been a moment's peace, since then. I will say from a regional perspective, those dams can provide up to 3 gigawatts, or it's around 3 large nuclear site power plants of on-demand energy. They average about 1,000 megawatts. That's about enough energy to serve a city the size of San Francisco. They are important. The downside, the debate is whether or not they are standing in the way of salmon recovery. And I know that certain groups really believe they are. There's groups that I represent that don't think there's the scientific evidence to say that they are the element that's standing in the way. But it's an area that doesn't seem to be able to find peace because there are ideological issues here. There's things that are below the surface. It's not just about salmon. Some of it's about tribal sovereignty. Some of it is about economic development. There's a lot of, there's a lot below the surface. So that's one thing I don't think is going to be resolved in 5 years. So thank you.
Okay, so we're going to keep going to questions, and if we can keep answers short, we'll try.
I'm sorry, he asked 2 questions. He asked 2 questions.
He has questions that you couldn't have answered any faster, but I just realized there are a lot of hands out there. And so I'm just going to let the microphone float here.
Do better, Kurt.
Thank you. This was a really interesting panel. I was wondering, I don't know a ton about the Canadian reservoir system, and if we're going to have these fluctuating flows and the flashy floods and climate change in the future, does Canada currently have the reservoir capacity to manage the floods if we assumed like perfect regional coordination between the US and Canada, or are we still looking for more storage capacity? And I know that you guys have also been interested in some other like natural solutions, and if you had other natural solutions and like more innovative solutions to this water management, I would be happy to hear them as well.
I think the key is you can have flood control, you can have fish passage, you can have restoration of salmon, you can have water flows, you can have no fluctuating lake levels, but you can't have them all at the same time. And people have been very, very, very slow, is the diplomatic way of putting it, to explicitly put out those trade-offs and say exactly whose ox is going to be gored when they do stuff like that. And so that's the crux of it, right?
That's really well said.
Well,
And John, you wanted to say something?
But the short answer is, yeah, there's lots of storage space in Canada to meet all of your flood control needs. And I believe the interim agreement only used about less than 60% of the storage capacity. So we've got a lot more to offer. But that's a price. From now on in, you have to pay.
So there's some questions over here. Yeah, I just want to make sure that, get over this side.
Why has there never been a fish ladder built at the Grand Coulee Dam?
Quite no fish passage at Grand Coulee Dam. The dam is extraordinarily large. I mean, in terms of height. I think the full is 1,290 feet is full elevation, and if you've been up there, it's a very difficult place to work your way around. What they're looking at right now, and again, DR Michel is going to be here today, I believe, and he's been a champion. Are you here, DR? Where are you? Oh, hey. So he'll be able to answer that question much better than me, but they are looking at potentially, I think, transportation around the dam is a way to like collect salmon and get them around. So just, I think, physics, it was a part of the issue.
but getting them up is one thing. The real kicker is getting them down to the turbines, right? And climate change is going to be a killer on all of that because, John already alluded to it. Unless they can build some low-level outlets and cold water outlets into those dams, you can get the fish back, but they're going to get cooked?
Well, DR has some great stories that, salmon are already making their way. They will dive down and they will go through the turbines. I do agree river temperature is an issue, but I think I would just slightly disagree and say that getting the salmon above a wall, that's the impossible part that we have to get around, and I think transportation looks like the way to do that.
Okay. So there's, I'm right there, and then back here.
So the AI was brought up in data centers, right? The demand for compute and energy associated with like data centers is like crazy, right? It's like terawatts on a national scale. We're talking about facilities right now, like in double-digit megawatts, triple-digit megawatts. Giant ones are like the big ones being built are like couple-digit gigawatts. So with that power demand, I'm curious, what are the contexts in the Columbia River? I know there's one nuclear power plant. What are the context there? What's the likelihood of more nuclear happening or not happening along the Columbia River Gorge, or generally in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, so the utilities all want nuclear. And the reason is that it's available 24/7. Even some of the new advanced small modular reactors can be kind of on-demand generation. And so most of all the carbon-free options of things that you can still build, because it's very hard to build a dam, right? In terms of environmental impacts and things like that. Of all the carbon-free options, that one seems to do the best job of replacing natural gas and coal because of its characteristics. But we don't know how many years away, and so I think that's a challenge. I think that, but I think, the data around support for nuclear has really changed in the last decade, and where the majority of Americans now do support nuclear. So I think it's possible if it becomes economically viable.
Right here.
That's okay.
I would like to ask about evaporation. So for the first thing is, what is the role of aquifer recharge, which is not subject to evaporation, and also given climate variability and need to store in the summertime? It seems like nobody's mentioned the role that changes in evaporation would occur. And I'm just curious about the role of evaporation in moderating the temperature near the reservoirs.
I
good
guess
question.
I can say a little bit. In terms of Washington State, there are quite a few aquifer storage and recovery and managed aquifer recharge projects that have been implemented and are ongoing as well. It's something that I think is picking up steam as a storage, as an approach to provide storage in groundwater that not only might be available for recovery later directly, but also as a way of propping up, if you will, stream flow because of the hydrological connectivity between groundwater and streams. So that is a really important approach for trying to facilitate or augment stream flow in the summer with water that is relatively low temperature. But I think the scale of that happening is pretty small. And so it's hard to know that it's the extent to which it can scale in a really significant way. I really don't know too much about aquifer storage and recovery in California, other than it's happening.
No, I mean, it's very extensive now in California. It will simply grow over time. I mean, it's the most logical form of storage here in California. So, John, then Kurt, I want to get your view on what the impact of evaporation is on hydropower. But John first.
Well, Jonathan mentioned the importance of irrigated agriculture, because as the climate dries, more lands will have to be irrigated to provide food security. And that's a big draw on Columbia River water. But there is provisions in the AIP that at a price, Canada is offering to have flows that would augment the amount of water available for agriculture and municipal water supplies. But there's a price tag attached to that. But I did my PhD actually in water conservation and agriculture. I won't tell you how many years ago. But I do believe now that with artificial intelligence, there is a very big opportunities for more efficient irrigation systems to irrigate more land with less water without foregoing crop productivity. So we have to be very adaptive and inventive to make this work.
Yeah, I think the economists would know better than me, but it's one thing to have a provision in a treaty that says if X happens, you pay so many dollars. But the practicalities of getting congressional approval or legislative approval to actually pay that money out of their aid budget when that happens, nobody wants to go there, right? So it's theoretically possible, but not as a practical matter in a lot of cases. The genius, as I always saw it in the Columbia River Treaty, was they had all these ways they could go sideways, right? But they agreed up front. I mean, the utilities didn't make out well because they ended up paying the piper. But the idea of equitable sharing of downstream benefits, where both countries can accomplish more by working cooperatively than they could have working independently for the same price. I mean, that's the genius that, I literally carry around the world to show, Afghanistan, how it can cooperate with Iran, Uzbekistan, how it can cooperate with Turkmenistan, because that's the way of doing it. Once you get lost in the minutiae and try to match costs and benefits, and it's all in the eye of the beholder, and you start having contingent payments and stuff, it's never enforceable in my experience. So.
I'm willing to skip my turn, and we can talk offline about evaporation. So.
Okay, sounds good. So we basically have about 2 minutes left, and so at this point, what I'd love to do is just give each of you an opportunity to say anything that is on your mind, and you each have about 30 seconds. So I don't know, who wants to start? John, I'll start out with you.
Well, I don't want to underestimate the title of this, the State of the West, and the economic importance of water to the West. The Columbia is a huge resource. It's got massive economic opportunities, and I think that they're still fully unrealized. And I hope that, but they can only be realized through collaboration, cooperation, and joint partnership. Any unilateral action is at detriment of both parties. So I think a collaborative model moving forward for the next 20 years will unleash some of this potential that's available in the Columbia.
Okay, thank you. Richard.
I totally agree with John. I think the way forward, we're in a bad space right now, but we have a long history of cooperation, and I think we can build on that cooperation going forward. So I'm cautiously optimistic for the future.
Great. And Kurt?
Having been admonished for talking too long earlier, I would just say that I would say that I think there are trade-offs. I think Richard said it really well. I think that we have to acknowledge that there are going to be some trade-offs in some of these things. I think one place where policymakers sometimes err on the wrong side is kind of promising all things to all people, and then there's a lot of disappointment. So I think that we have to be practical about some of these things and understand what those trade-offs are, and then make intelligent decisions about them.
Thanks. And Jonathan?
I guess just really quickly following on the trade-off idea, I think that what we've learned about the negotiations over the Columbia River Treaty so far suggests that the negotiators are fully aware of what those trade-offs are. That clearly there is an interest in more flexibility. There is an interest in more Canadian flexibility for pursuing domestic interests than was allowable in the original Columbia River Treaty. And so I completely agree that there are trade-offs, of course. I think that some of them maybe are being recognized. And that is reflected in the agreement in principle, at least what we know about it.
Okay, thank you very much. If you could join me in thanking John and Richard and Kurt and Jonathan for a fantastic panel.
Thank you, man. We did it.